I've been debating whether or not to give this tutorial away for free because this is really powerful. You are going to be able to learn any song on the Boss RC-505 and be able to loop it. And oh boy, that is some good information. One of the most common questions that loopers get asked is how did you do this? How did you make this? How did you make this song? And we're about to learn how to do that. I have 22 different tips and tricks to be able to learn any track, and the first one is going to be look for tutorials already. It's pretty straightforward. Just type the name of the song, the word loopstation tutorial in the Google search bar, and see if that track already has a tutorial that's out. That is a pretty useful way to find that. Another way to do that search is to actually type that title in Japanese, because a lot of Japanese beatboxers and loopers are making tutorials as well. Next tip I can give you is to learn your tool. Learn how to use the loop station. Know what sounds are possible. Watch many tutorials, learn many songs. This basically just gain experience with this device, and you'll know how to do certain things. You'll be able to hear something that someone does, and you'll be like, oh, I recognize that they are using da-da-da with a da-da-da. Like, that's like a really good way to be able to learn tracks. Next tip is to take notes as you discover new things, so then you don't forget values and whatnot. You're going to be exploring, reversing, playing back the track many times. You're going to be making cool discoveries and figuring out certain things. But sometimes us loopers will change a value in the middle of the track or change certain things in the middle of the song. You want to be able to remember what those values are. You also want to be able to remember values that are the closest that you can get to the thing. So sometimes I will be working on a track and I'll be like, okay, this is how they made this sound, and this is the parameters that I have to get close to that. Let me write these down. So then I'm going to experiment a little bit, try different parameters, try different EQs, and really hone in the sound. So then I have the original sound, and then I have my version of that sound. Next tip I can give you is to work one track at a time. I would recommend starting with the hardest track to completely destroy your confidence in being able to make the song. No. Realistically, if you can make the hardest track on the device, all the rest of the tracks are going to kind of come together. Now, what I mean by work on the hardest track, I don't mean work on it until completion, figure out all the track effects that are used on that specific track, and then have it 100% polished. I do not mean that. What I mean is open up your loop station, listen to the hardest track, and just try to get a general replication of that track. Usually the drum kit is the last thing that I will work on. And once I have 3, 4, and 5 figured out, and I have most of the track effects kind of figured out what they're going to be, then I'll start working on the drum kit. The next tip I can give you is to study the artist's full body of work. For example, what tools and techniques do they like? For example, Biscuit really likes vocal distortions and granular delays. That information might be really helpful to figure out how some of his tracks works. Leonard really likes the guitar to bass. Knowing that information is really useful, so you know that if Leonard likes using guitar to bass, they're probably not using a transpose, a pitch bend, or an octave to make some of the sounds. But you can only know that by studying their work and by following them on social medias. Listen to them on Spotify, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok. Watch their live streams, watch them battle if they have battles, actually follow their social medias, consume their work, really, really study the artists. Next is to look at multiple performances of their songs. Oftentimes on YouTube, you'll see, or on their Instagram or any social media that they have, they will post samples or their entire track multiple times, different versions of it. They'll have it on Spotify. They will have a performance in battles. Like, all of these performances are going to be helpful in being able to figure out what they're doing. And the steps that I'm going to be talking about in a little bit will also be helpful in getting that data, because you'll be able to see multiple camera angles, multiple different versions. You'll be able to possibly hear or see how they're performing certain things. The next step is kind of a filter on whether you can even learn the song or not. So you're going to look for the equipment they use. Do you own that equipment? Can you work around that, not owning that equipment? So some loopers have extra devices that they use in order to make a song. Matei, for example, uses 2 MK1s to make Blindfold. I only own 1 MK1. However, I really wanted to make Blindfold, and so I figured out a way to make Blindfold with just 1 loop station. That was a way I was able to work around that. Other times people have launch pads or MIDI devices or extra devices. Is there a way to work around that? So just because they have a device that you don't have doesn't necessarily mean that you can't make the song. You'll just have to find ways to work around not having that device. Next tip is a really powerful one. Look for other people performing the same song, because not everyone is going to do it flawlessly. Mistakes actually reveal a lot about the piece that you're going to be working on. Next tip is to look in their video and Instagram comments. Again, going back to consuming their content, look through any performance that they have, battles, solos, wildcards, etc. Go into the comments section. Sometimes someone will ask the question like, how did he do this? Then someone will answer like, oh, they did it like this. That is helpful information. You can also ask questions in the comments yourself, like, and don't say, how did you ... whatever. Say, how did they ... Wording it like that will allow the question to be posed to the community as a whole rather than the artist as an individual. So then anyone can be able to answer the question. So you're not just relying on one person. Next tip I can give you, and this is a pro tip in general, post the wrong answer on purpose. I know that there's a law on the internet about posting the wrong answer to be able to get a question answered, but there's a specific way that you should do this that you don't sound like a pompous butthole. So don't say, he used X to make that sound. Instead, phrase it like this. Say something like, did he use X to make that sound? ? Or you say, I bet it was X, Y, and Z. And so that way your comment isn't confidently incorrect, and instead is just proposing, hey, I think this is how they made this thing. And then someone will correct you and be like, no, that's wrong. This is how they made it. Boom. Thank you for that data. That is really helpful. I appreciate that. Awesome. This is also very helpful when asking artists themselves on how they make certain things. If you show them that you put in the work and said, look, I am trying my best here. This is as close as I can get. I need your help. They're more likely to be able to help you and answer your questions. Next tip is to watch what they do with their mouth and their hands. So you want to use your eyes as much as your ears when learning how to do a certain song. So you're going to watch for mistakes, like a missed button press. Those are actually very helpful too, because you don't want to confuse an actual button press for a mistake when it was a mistake and not an actual part of the song. Another tip about watching is this actually comes from the speedrunning community, specifically the blindfold speedrunner community, and that's called normalized movement. In speedrunning context, it's something that speedrunners will use to be consistent every single time. So, for example, they'll move their character model up against a corner of a wall. So even if you're blindfolded, you know, hey, I am in this corner of the wall, and I can do 2 backflips of my character, and I will be in this same exact spot every single time. For loopstation context, you're going to be using normalized movement to figure out where their screen is and what settings that they're looking for. Some examples of normalized movement for the loop station is watch for them pushing the exit button. If they push the exit button, you know exactly what screen they're on. They're on the home page here. Other normalized movement is even if you can't see or the angle is bad, you have light coming from the device, coming off of the device, and you have the position of their hand. You know track 1's over here and track 5 is over here. Next to track 5 is the track effects. Next to track 1 is the input effects. You can use the knobs or even the holes on the back to be able to tell the orientation of the device. So if you see them push something over here, you know they're probably recording something on track 5. Another way to normalize your movement is to look for blind moves. For example, moving the value knob very quickly to the left or right. If they move the value knob blindly, like they just kind of flick it in one direction, you know they're in a track effect or an input effect that is on the end of the device. So if they go all the way over here, you saw them tap track effects A, you know they're on vinyl flick. Or if they go all the way over here, you know they're on filter. But not only that, but you can also see how many clicks they do from the normalized movement. So let's say you see them tap track effects B and they go far left, and then you see them kind of pander over to, you know they're on flanger. Or if you see them messing around for a while, then you know they're in something towards the center. Additionally, if you know an effect is being used, like for example, if you know that they are on a ring modulator and you see them tap over just one to the right, you know they're going to be on guitar to bass. Or if they're on a EQ and you see them go a little bit over, you know that they're on something to the right. Even if you don't know what it is, you saw them go from EQ to something to the right that's not near the ends. Like, that is a lot of helpful information to be able to discern what effect that they might be using. Another thing to look for is the input effect and track effects knobs. What position are those going to be in? Like, did they flick it to the far left? Guess what? Now you know the parameter that they are using for their device. Oftentimes, I will use the knob normalized movement to figure out things like the reverb of a track. I hope you've gotten some good information out of this so far, but let's move on to the next one. So the next tip is to record a clean plate. Now, a clean plate is a sample of the track that has no other effects and no other sounds happening at the same time. So the drums are off, you're just hearing the pure raw sound. These are really, really useful in a multitude of different ways. One is you can use them as the actual part of the song. So a question that I've gotten a lot is, how do I do MK2 tracks on the MK1? Well, to do that, what I do is I just make the sample on the MK2, and then I import that sample onto the MK1 and just use that as the actual part. And the MK1 has a lot of the same effects as the MK2, so I can just alter it that way. So that is one way that you can do that, is just record a clean plate of the performance. A lot of times loopers will have a clean plate of some of their sounds at the very, very beginning of the song that they either cut out, which is, again, why watching multiple performances is useful. And you can record their clean plate. Another thing you could do is use it as reference for track effect settings. I'll just record the clean plate on a track, and then I'll be using that version that they recorded themselves to try to match the parameters of the track effects. So if I have a clean plate of something, this is something that I recorded myself, so it's not a clean plate of Leonard performing this, but you can even hear my metronome in the background. So I have, let's say I record this directly from Leonard's video. Then I can go in and I can figure out, like, oh, okay, so now I can figure out what the parameters are. I know there's a vocal distortion involved, and I know that there's a guitar to bass involved. But at what parameter do I make the thing? Okay, that sounds exactly like it's done in the video. That's probably the parameters. And then from there, you can go in and perform the actual thing yourself and then adjust the parameters from there so then the mixing is the same for your entire track. Another thing about recording clean plates is you can use it as a reference to find the input effects to make it. So if you record the clean plate of them doing a drum kit or drum sample, for example, you can then try to replicate that sample yourself on another track. It helps you with getting your timing down or figuring out, okay, where's my timing? So you can start with a ghost track on the thing you're recording and try to match the timing of the clean plate on what's going on over here. The next tip is to use an online pitch detector to find notes of things. I use this all the time to try to find notes. So this is the pitch detector that I use. It's been very, very helpful in figuring out like granular delay notes and other delay, panning delay stuff. It's helpful to be able to figure out my own vocals and tuning my own vocals to fit the track that I'm performing. This is a very, very useful tool that I use all the time. The next tip is to use post-processing yourself. So for example, you could record it in Audacity or Audition and then edit it that way. Like for example, I really love using the spectrogram in Audition to be able to really analyze tracks and be able to hear them really, really well. And I can isolate specific hertz and band ranges, so then I can hear just the track and be able to figure out like, oh, okay, I can remove like the bass line, for example, or I can only just hear the bass line, and then I know what notes the bass line is going to be. The next tip is really unfortunate, but it is what it is. EQ is going to be the most important factor, but it's also the hardest factor to figure out. The number one reason why your sounds don't sound like their sounds is probably because your EQ is wrong and off. You're going to have to understand how EQ works, how each one of these sounds and the ranges of each one of these, and be able to train your ear. This is just going to come from experience with using this device and just learning music in general. You're going to have to learn how to make their EQ if you want it to sound anything like what they're making. Now, oftentimes I will just say F it and just use my own EQ for a lot of things, but a lot of times I want to replicate their EQ as closely as possible. Then from there, once I have their EQ settings, then I can edit my EQ so that it best matches my style and my performance of the track. EQ is really a tricky balancing act on how to best mix and to make your track sound. Next tip I can give you is don't neglect the input sound. Doing different sounds into the device will net different things. Bass lines of panning delay is going to be different depending on what their input sound is. Figuring out what input effect you want to have is going to have a completely different effect on like how you do certain things. All of those are different input effects that come out very, very differently. Another tip is to use track effects to dial in what your input effect should be. Like I'll be working on a track and I'll be like, okay, I know that they're using an EQ and a panning delay, but what kind of slicer pattern are they using? I can't seem to figure that part out. So I'll record what I know with the input effects onto a track, and then I'll use the track effects to be able to change things and just listen. I don't have to be focusing on the input sound and making the thing. I could just let the thing play, and then I can go through each one of the slicer patterns, for example, and listen to how those sounds. I can use that to dial in parameters, for example. So I'm like, okay, I know it's a P1 slicer, but I don't know what the rate is going to be, so I can just listen to that and use my metronome to figure out the rate. Being able to figure out the parameters for a specific input effect is really, really helpful, and that can help with EQ a lot. I told you that EQ is really important. Well, let's say you know how the effect is made. You know it uses these two effects, but you don't know what EQ they have on it. Guess what? Make the effect with the input effects without any EQ, put it on a track, and then actually go into a track effects and mess with the EQ settings of that track. And you can really dial in your EQ that way too. Next tip is don't get caught up in adjusting your effects to your best take or even their take. Let's say you record a clean plate and you set up your parameters or your effects to match exactly what they do. Well, that's not very helpful if you are performing the track. This is your voice. This is going to be your style. Like, the goal is not to copy word for word, sound for sound what someone else did. The goal is to make some piece of art. So let's say you have like a really good take of a specific sound or a track, and then you try to adjust your settings to your best take. That might be helpful in figuring out like where to start. But what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to adjust the tracks and the parameters to what your average take is going to be. So what you're going to do is you're going to do multiple takes yourself and figure out the best average for what you're doing. Next tip I'll give is actually looking at the video and edit the video itself. So for example, you can loop certain parts so you can watch the moves that they do with their hands and where their hands go to like literally loop the part of the video. You can go frame by frame and watch where their hand goes, or watch how many times they push the arrow button so you know what parameter they're adjusting. You can increase the exposure of the actual video to see what the white lines on the knobs. So sometimes they'll record with effects on the video or they'll record it in a dark room. But if you turn up the exposure, it'll make the video more brighter, and then you can actually see details. You can also, with editing video, you can zoom in and you can see like just the half of the loop station that is pertinent to the thing that you're working on. So editing the video is also really, really helpful. Tip number 19, we're still not done yet, is to ask the artists themselves. So you can say, how did you make this track effect? Don't just ask the artist in general, like, how did you make this song? Or do a tutorial, please. Because that's a big ask for someone to actually do. And not a lot of loopers are going to pay attention to that. And on top of that, it's not going to be helpful at all. What will be helpful is you trying your best to figure things out the best you can, put actual effort into the track that they put 100 times more effort than you did into making the song. And then when you are stuck or you're trying to figure out something, then you can actually ask the specific question of, I've gotten this far and this has been really, really hard and I can't seem to figure out this piece. Like, show that you are supporting them and actually support them. Like, put in the effort to learn and really appreciate the piece that they put together. Oh my God, music is so beautiful and it's so much fun to be able to mess around with. And I just do this for fun for myself. I can't illustrate all of that to them without sounding completely autistic. So you need to be able to show them that through your questions and asking very, very specific, like, if you're wondering about timing of certain things or a single, like, I know you're using an EQ on B and a reverb on C, but what are you using on A? Like, or posting your best guess. Like, those are helpful. Another thing that I have done a lot is pay them to acquire their knowledge. Like, these people are artists. They do this stuff for a living sometimes. Pay them. Pay them with money. If you're going to support the artists, give them money. Like, I do this all the time. Like, I want to be able to acquire the knowledge, but I also want to be able to support them. Might as well do both. So donate to your favorite loop artists. If you want them to give you information, like, on how to make a certain thing, why don't you just pay them? Tip number 20, still not done, is to ask someone who does a lot of tutorials or other artists. on how to do certain things. Two examples I can think of is Vision Elf and Ben Beat. They make a lot of tutorials. They understand a lot of stuff. Me, I make a lot of tutorials and make a lot of stuff, so I can figure things out a lot of times. But asking other artists, so for example, like Reddit, go on Reddit and ask the question to r/loopstation or r/beatbox. Again, posting what you know, so then people have a good starting point on where to begin trying to figure stuff out. Please don't like bother individuals like all the time having them collaborate and build an entire track with you, like unless they want to, but odds are they don't. Every once in a while, like if you're really, really, really stuck, like feel free to crowdsource information and ask them the questions. Next is you'll discover a lot with failure. So you learn things that things aren't, things are not. Like you can use the IFX TFX dot chart to eliminate possibilities. So for example, if you know their input sound, you can try to put on several different effects and be like, okay, well, I know it's not a isolator that they're using because there's not a band that's being removed. So there's probably not an isolator there, or a tape echo. There's probably not a delay involved. You can remove those from the list or whatever. And my last tip that I can give you is understand that it may not sound exact. Your goal is not to copy what they're doing. Your goal is to cover or be inspired by what they are doing. And this can happen due to multiple reasons. One, your instrument is different. So you're not using their guitar, you're not using their synth, you're not using their voice box. Like you have a different face than they do. You also have post-processing that you have to think about. So a lot of times when we make these videos, we will process the sound in post by doing things like mixing or EQing after the fact. With everything that's said, go out there, have fun, consume their work. This is, like I said, this is a really long video, but I hope there's a lot of good information that will now help you in figuring out how to make literally any song that you want to. Like, that's freaking exciting. So go out there, have fun, pay these artists who are making these awesome pieces of art, and I will see you in the next tutorial.